Support for the Brülosophy podcast comes from the following. The best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. Find everything from classics to modern favorites, as well as cool experimental varieties and a vast array of ingredients and gear at yakimavalleyhops.com. Love to Brew is a national leader in homebrewing supplies, offering exclusive products such as East Coast yeast, TV taps, and Brülosophy recipe kits, all with free shipping on orders over $75. When you need brewing ingredients or equipment, check out Love to Brew at love2brew.com. Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today Matt Del Fiacco will be joining me to talk about first wort hopping, a really simple method I first heard about years ago that's said to impart a smoother bitterness compared to adding hops at the beginning of the boil. It's kind of the standard approach. And interestingly, some people claim that it even has some like flavor and aroma carryover as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a technique that I first read about when I was researching, making a better Czech lager. And people really talk about like that first wort hop addition is providing a more rounded bitterness with a lot more, some fuller flavor and aroma characteristics as well.
I'm excited to talk about this stuff because I don't quite understand how it could do that. But I know that you've been digging into some of the history of first wort hopping and stuff. I think it's going to be really interesting. And Stan Hieronymus recently wrote about some new research performed at Oregon State University that I'm looking forward to kind of getting into. But before we do that, we've got some stuff to let everybody know about. First, I mentioned it a while back in the last episode that we've got a new contributor, Jason Cipriani, and I'm really excited to have him on board and just kind of want to make more of an official announcement. He reached out to me months ago before HomebrewCon 2017. I strung him along a little bit to see, well, it wasn't intentional, but he kind of proved his interest by sticking around and he continued to talk with me, and I learned that he's a really cool guy. And so Jason's going to be joining the crew. He is already brewing for Brülosophy, and you'll start to see some articles with his name attached to them being published very soon over at Brülosophy.com. And in fact, he, in addition to doing experiments, the Hop Chronicles, and all of that stuff, he's going to be kickstarting our newest series, which I'm going to talk about now. A couple years ago, I brewed a batch of beer using very unconventional methods. And the reason being, my wife had taken a couple of my kids out to do some shopping on a Saturday morning, and I got the itch and just wanted to brew, but I knew I didn't have that much time. So I did this kind of small batch with a short mash and a short boil, no starter, all of that stuff. I expected the beer to be really bad, but surprisingly it wasn't. And so I wrote an article about it, and I ended up naming this weird approach Short and Shoddy. Since then, a couple of us at Brülosophy have messed around with different styles and whatnot, and we've written about it, occasionally. And every time we've been really surprised. The results have far surpassed our expectations, and so we thought we would turn it into its own series. And I'm really excited about this. Our plan is to work our way through every style in the BJCP guidelines using these blasphemous brewing methods, and then we're going to have blind tasters provide more organized feedback than we have in the past. It should be a lot of fun, and I'm stoked that Jason's going to be working on this right off the bat here. So for the last couple of months, I've been talking a little bit about setting up a deal with a pre-existing retailer out there to sell Brülosophy merch for us. We started the Brülosophy store a few months ago. We were selling glasses and hats and our Brutility belts and all that stuff. And it was a surprising success. We sold out of all of that stuff really quickly. In fact, we just started selling a new set of glasses, and in 4 days, we basically sold out. I think we've got like 16 glasses out of 150 left.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts.
That's awesome.
And now the thing is, my wife, beautiful and wonderful as she is, has been managing all of the packaging and the shipping and taking care of that while I'm doing my normal day job. And it's a lot of work, and she's doing great. But my goal was to move that away from us so that we can focus on producing content while our fans can still get their hands on some of our merch. Well, Brian Hall, one of our new contributors, and I met up in Yakima for Hop Harvest a couple weeks ago. And we had a nice little sit-down meeting with the dudes at Yakima Valley Hops. And what we decided was that they are going to take over essentially all of our merchandising. They're gonna do our orders for us and sell stuff and be able to ship it out, so that way people all over have constant access to Brülosophy merch. Now, this isn't set up just yet. We still have some stuff to figure out, but it's going to happen. I'm really excited about this, and I'm even tapping the graphic design genius of Melissa Gatton, who does a lot of the really cool stuff for Yakima Valley Hops. She's going to be working with me to come up with some new stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. And on a side note, I want to mention that in addition to talking about merch stuff, we also spent some time chatting about other ways that Brülosophy is going to collaborate with Yakima Valley Hops. And I can't say too much now, but I'm telling you, the future holds some really rad stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. So keep your eyes open, keep your eyes peeled for that. We both share a passion for wanting to keep homebrewing the raddest hobby on earth. So that's all I'm saying. We'll be announcing some events here shortly. So a couple of months ago, I proposed the idea of starting a Brülosophy club, like a homebrew club, an online homebrew club. And the response was really, really positive to that. And it kind of scared me a little because I started realizing how I just don't have the time to run something like that, to run a club and do all of that stuff. So instead of letting the idea fizzle out, because it sounded like a lot of people were very interested in that, I thought maybe we would kind of throw the idea out there of having someone else with experience and with interest kind of handle that stuff for us. And so if you're that person, if you like organizing clubs and communicating with a big group of people, stuff like that, feel free to hit me up, let me know, and we'll see if we can't work something out for the Brew Club. And this is, one of the things with the Brew Club is that we kind of want, well, it could be whatever it is, whatever it becomes. But I thought it'd be fun if this is one of those things where if people were to submit, beers into competitions that were made using these short and shoddy methods we just talked about, stuff like that. We just kind of want to have a lot of fun with the whole thing. So if you're interested in maybe running an online club or at least contributing to the running of an online club, shoot me an email, marshall@brülosophy.com. All right, something people have been begging for since we started the Brülosophy podcast. Weekly episodes. That's right. Thanks to the incredibly generous support of our fans and especially our sponsors, we're going to be able to start pushing out an episode per week starting in January of 2018. This is exciting and it's a bit daunting for me because it does require a ton of work. But I know we've got this. I'm really excited. Thanks to everyone who's been supporting us so far, and expect to hear a lot more of our sultry voices starting in 2018. Hey, don't forget that we're always in need of experiment participants. If you live in or around Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Anchorage, Alaska, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, Georgia, Corona, California, or Fresno, California, and you want to lend your palate to brewing science, let us know. We'll get you hooked up with a contributor near you. If you have any questions for our Brew and A episodes, email them to me, marshall@brülosophy.com, or you can drop them on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or any of the other places we hang out online. If you'd like to throw some support our way, which we really appreciate, you can head over to brülosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you shop at places like Amazon, More Beer, Adventures in Homebrewing, Love to Brew, and most other online homebrew shops. You won't feel a thing, and we get a small commission that helps us to keep bringing you these shows. If you want a little something in return for your support, check out our Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you'll be granted access to never-before-published Brülosophy recipes, receive invites to monthly video chats, and you can even work with us to design your very own experiment. That's patreon.com/Brülosophy. We just had our monthly video chat, and it was a lot of fun. Always is.
Yep.
Finally, please make sure to subscribe to the Brülosophy podcast wherever it is you listen to your podcasts, and we'd really appreciate if you left a review as well. These things help us out. They're really easy for you to do, and it's just fun to read what people think about this stuff. Okay, it's time for the either loved or hated segment of the Brülosophy podcast, the 1-minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. Now for this one, I served my buddies a beer that I brewed. And it was a unique beer. It was a short and shoddy oatmeal porter. So this was a beer that I made using, not so conventional methods. I believe I think I did a 20-minute mash and a 20-minute boil. I wrote all about it over at brülosophy.com. You can head over there and search for oatmeal porter to read all about it. And without telling my friends what it was they were drinking, I served it to them. 1-minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
I'm sure you're going to say it's portery.
No. It's port, dumbass.
Oh, look who's... No, dude!
got a nice roast.
Yeah, it's coffee.
It's very good.
Except it's cold and it doesn't cost $17. It's good. It's coffee. It's very good coffee. Obviously, the mash had some coffee.
It's got a great smell.
It's just coffee. What kind of coffee is it?
I don't know.
Do you even think that it's coffee, or are you going to tell me that it's something like
I don't think
juniper?
it's coffee. No, it's nowhere near.
Then
juniper.
what is it?
It's definitely like oaky roast. Like oak, not oaky, oak roast. I mean,
Would you drink another pint?
I would.
Would you?
Why not?
I would drink another pint, and here's why. Because it tastes like coffee, and I love coffee.
I would drink it. It's got a nice roast taste to it. Marshall down.
I'm sorry, we can't review this beer anymore because Marshall just fell over. I dedicate this sip to Marshall.
Hey, they liked it. I can't believe it. I fully expected this being as dark of a beer as it was, which is kind of outside of their wheelhouse, that they were just going to bash it. But they liked it. And in fact, they described it in the way that I would describe it myself. This beer was very creamy and smooth and coffee-like, had a really nice roast character that wasn't sharp or astringent. In fact, it was probably one of the better porters I've ever made. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be brewing this same exact recipe again in the future. In fact, it was this one that inspired the starting of the Short and Shoddy series. So there you have it. It was a good beer. If you guys are interested in cutting out a little bit of time on your brew day and you want an oatmeal porter, go check out that recipe at Brülosophy.com. I'm sure you will be pleased. All right, it's time to take a quick break. And when we come back, Matt and I will be breaking down everything that is first wort hopping. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste time chilling wort, which is why I use cleverly designed immersion chillers from Jaded Brewing. After some bad experiences with counterflow and plate chillers, I began the search for a more efficient chilling solution and discovered Jaded. That was nearly 4 years ago, and to this day, I continue to rely on the King Cobra and the Hydra to chill my wort in record time without the setup or cleaning hassle of other chillers. If you're looking for a way to optimize your brew day, I can't recommend Jaded chillers enough. Go see what they have to offer at jadedbrewing.com and let them know Brülosophy sent you. So first wort hopping. This is to put it simply, a technique where a relatively large portion of hops are added to the wort before it reaches a boil.
Really, first wort hopping has kind of two sides to it. There's that bitterness aspect, and then there's the flavor aroma aspect. From a bittering perspective, like how we typically get our bitterness in wort is through a process where alpha acids in the hops are isomerized around 175 degrees Fahrenheit, and then that's like kind of the start of that isomerization process, and then it really kicks up around boiling temperatures. But those alpha acids are isomerized and turn into isoacids, which are much more soluble in wort than the alpha acid component, which are pretty poorly soluble. And those contribute bitterness to our beer.
So iso-alpha acids are the bitterness that we taste in the beer. Primarily, the bitterness that we get in beer is the isomerized version of these alpha acids that exist in hops.
Yep, exactly. And so through that, we have obviously a much more soluble product that contributes that bitterness. And the idea behind first wort hopping is that by adding hops prior to the beginning of the boil, we're able to extract a more rounded bitterness from those hops. And then there's also that flavor and aroma. So people who do first wort hopping claimed that the first wort hopping contributes, a finer bitterness, and then lends like a flavor and aroma perspective where it's a little more full and a little more well-rounded as well. So it's much more of like a bouquet of aroma and flavor, if you will, than something that would be added in a later edition.
So that's interesting to me. This is when I first read about first wort hopping, I found myself scratching my head quite a bit because it didn't, the science. In fact, I couldn't find much in the way of an explanation for how first wort hopping does these things.
Right.
But the claim, I think most brewers view a typical, say, 60-minute bittering addition as imparting very little in the way of flavor or aroma, and that it's you're using that just to get those isomerized alpha acids into the beer so that it's bitter enough, right, to balance the beer out. Then there's this part of this carryover of flavor and aroma that just doesn't make sense to me. How is it that adding I'm going to sound really dumb here, but how is it that you can add hops before the wort comes to a boil? So it's in contact with the wort longer, but then it goes through the same boil that a standard 60-minute addition.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like it doesn't.
I do.
It seems like this like magical thinking type of thing, but there are people who are claiming that it really has a noticeable impact on flavor, and I started doing it for various reasons that we'll get into later. So that piece of it has always been really confusing to me. Have you found anything on how that's said to work?
So the exact mechanisms of first wort hopping, I don't want to say they're not that well researched, because obviously there can be a lot of research done on this that I don't know about, but they're not that well established. And we don't know for sure kind of a lot of that. And if we do, then I haven't seen anyone who's written about it. And I haven't seen any conclusive evidence from like a paper perspective. But you bring up a really interesting point that typically what we believe is that earlier additions of hops, like the bittering hops, don't contribute anything in the way of flavor and aroma. And there are actually two different approaches to first wort hopping. One is a more Americanized version of it, which Randy Mosher actually talks a little bit about in Radical Brewing, where the bittering hops are just added before the boil starts. So all the bittering hops are added. You extract probably a little bit more IBUs because they're above isomerization temperatures longer.
So that approach is sounds like it's it's hinged more on the bitterness component of that earlier edition, and then maybe there's a perspective where first wort hopping there are people who use it as more of that flavor and aroma.
Right. So and they use it more of that, but also like kind of in conjunction, where the more what I would probably call the traditional approach, but some of the earliest evidence we have of first wort hopping is actually from a 1995 article in Wort International, and I apologize as always for my pronunciations of anything German, by Priest, Nuremberg, and Mitter, called "The Rediscovery of First Wort Hopping." And in this article, they tested with two German production breweries a beer made where a portion of the late additions of the hops were actually moved and used as the first wort hop. About 30% of the late addition hops used as the first wort hop, and then the regular bittering charge. So that it has nothing to do with the movement of the bittering charge, but more to do with the work on the late addition. And we can talk more about that experiment in a sec, but the point I'm trying to make here is that through these approaches, you'd think that by moving some of those late addition hops to the front, that you wouldn't actually be doing anything for the flavor and aroma. You would be just contributing more to your bitterness and removing some of those compounds from the flavor and from the aroma. That said, like we talked about those mechanisms not being well researched, there are some hypotheses out there on why actually doing that hops, by adding those hops pre-boil, you are actually contributing to both your bitterness and a hop flavor and aroma, despite going through that, pretty volatile boil.
It's a really interesting perspective on this. Like I can, the psychologist in me can't help but wonder what it was going through the minds of the people who thought that this first wort hop would have more of an impact on aroma and flavor than it would bitterness. And that's, again, that's my kind of like my thinking is locked in this very conventional idea that the earlier you add hops to wort, regardless of whether it's boiling or not, the more bitterness you're going to get. Like that's just like, I can't break away from that idea. And so it seems really, I don't know, kind of creative to look at it differently and to take 30% of those later hop additions, throw them in before the boil starts, leave them in throughout that boil, and then to presume that it's going to have some sort of qualitative impact on that beer.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of the key hypotheses out there regarding the beginning of first wort hopping has to do with the increased utilization of hops, because they would be in those isomerization temperatures for a longer period of time. As a production brewery, you could use less hops and get more bitterness without necessarily extending the length of your boil. But like you said, like it's kind of contrary to what we would say is the classic approach to hop additions, where that longer boil is going to remove a lot of those flavor and aroma compounds. And there's two pretty solid hypotheses out there. I think one's a little more fleshed out than the other, but the first is that because these hops aren't boiled, the compounds in the hops actually have more time to oxidize, and they have more time to react with oxygen and other things in the hops, and they result in a compound that won't be vaporized during the boil. So during that boil, like now that those compounds are less volatile and they're less likely to be boiled off, you actually maintain them, and it stays throughout the fermentation process and contributes that rounded bitterness and that more full flavor and aroma character to the beer.
That makes zero sense to me. I mean, I'm just going to say, like, I don't know how, like, and this is, I'm not saying that it's not true. What I'm saying is that my mind can't understand how in the world adding hops, in the 20 minutes that it takes to reach a boil on average, that hops being in contact with the wort in that 20 minutes and then continuing on through the rest of the boil is going to have that kind of an effect. It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And so is there, I couldn't find any. Have you found any good explanation for like how that actually works?
So a little bit, and here it actually leads into a little bit our second explanation, that second hypothesis that actually comes to us from a study done by Miller Coors. So for those of you who don't know, like Miller Coors uses hop extracts and hop compounds in their beer, and because of that, they actually do a lot of experimentation around, what different compounds in the hop contribute to the beer that we wouldn't classically think of as contributing flavor or aroma or body or what have you. And Stan Hieronymus talks a little bit about this in his book, For the Love of Hops. And in that, he calls it, kettle hop flavor. And the idea is that pre-boil additions actually help with the solubility of glycosides, and that more of these glycosides survive the wort boiling process. So these glycosides are a compound in the hop that are effectively a protein or a compound and a sugar, glucose, and they have a glycosidic bond, which is then, because they're now maintained throughout the hops, and they survive the wort boiling process, they actually get cleaved in half during fermentation by biotransformation. So yeast would actually wreck these glycosidic bonds. So if you have a linalool, linalool is a hop compound that we typically would associate with like floral aroma and flavor characteristics. If you have a linalool glycoside compound and it gets cleaved during fermentation, the idea is that you actually have more linalool in your finished beer than you would if that compound had precipitated out during the boil.
That is really interesting, and it leads to the I guess it leads me to think that by first wort hopping, you're going to produce some sort of a noticeable impact as compared to a standard kettle hop addition. And like you mentioned, there hasn't been very much research in the way, or there's not much that we've been able to find, at least, in the way of explaining how this works in a very clear, I guess, a clear, robust sort of way. But there has been quite a bit of research or kind of digging into the organoleptic impact of first wort hopping.
Probably the first one that would be best to cover is like the rediscovery of first wort hopping, the article published in Brault International. And they actually, like I mentioned, they have the two production breweries. And what they did was each brewery made two versions of a Pilsner. The first was a beer that was done with just a standard bittering charge and a standard late addition. And the second was a beer that was done with a first wort hop that comprised of 30% of the hops of the late addition by weight, then a bittering charge, and then they actually omitted the late addition entirely for that second Pilsner. And in a panel, they actually found that in a panel of 23, that 21 people were able to pick the odd beer out, and 19 of those 21 preferred the first wort hop beer.
That is an astounding.
It is. It's doing
result.
Some of the work we do. It's an unbelievable level of significance.
Yeah, and it would now. I think it's deserving. This is not the type. This is a test. You kind of pointed out this Americanized first wort hop versus the more traditional
Yes.
first wort hopping approach. This is a research on that more traditional perspective. And so
Correct.
what they're really, in my opinion, it's almost like they're comparing first wort hop to a late wort or a late kettle edition hopping. And from that, what we can glean, at least from their research, that if you take that late hop edition, that late kettle hop edition, and you use that as the first wort hop, or 30% of that at least, as the first wort hop, and then keep that bittering addition, then you're going to produce a beer that is qualitatively different than a beer that has no first wort hop, but rather has those hops added in at the end of the boil. That doesn't surprise me nearly as much as some of the research that's been done on what we're going to call this kind of more American style first wort hopping.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in that first wort, like kind of the American version of first wort hopping, just to recap, is using pretty much the entirety of the bittering addition as your first wort hop. So just adding those bittering additions as the wort is either heating up to a boil or just draining into, obviously, your boil kettle from your mash or lauter tun.
So there's just real quick to touch on methods that this can be done. On the homebrewing scale, at the very least, and I have some friends who are professional brewers as well. Typically, the way first wort hopping is done is you take that bittering addition, or whatever your first wort hop addition ends up being, you toss it into the kettle before you lauter and from your mash tun into the kettle. And so that wort, as it's being transferred into your boil kettle, is getting in contact with that first wort hop addition. And then as it's coming up to a boil, they're in contact the entire time. So that's a typical way. I've been asked questions, well, how do you do this when you're doing brew in a bag on the homebrew scale? Very easy. I think what most people do is as soon as they remove the bag, they toss in their first wort hops. Same concept. Those hops are in contact with the wort before it comes to a boil. And this is some more research that was done by our friend Denny Kahn from the Experimental Brewing Podcast, as well as authors of all those fun, whimsical books out there. And I think it was back in 2007, I believe, he performed some research on this more, again, this kind of American style of first wort hopping, where he brewed 2 batches. One of them received the first wort hop edition. One of them was a standard 60-minute edition. And he served these beers to, I'm not sure if they were blind. I don't know if the participants knew of the variable or not. In fact, I think they knew what was going on, but he served these beers to a group of BJCP judges and professional brewers.
In that panel, Denny had about 18 testers, and from that panel, only 7 were able to pick the odd beer out.
Which, if you look at this was written up in a Brew Your Own article that we were able to find, and they refer to this as significant. But based on the statistic that we use, this really is not significant. 7 out of 18 is it's actually less than half, and it leaves us with a p-value of 0.39, which means that tasters were unable to distinguish the odd beer out with any reliability, and leaving us with non-significant results. And interestingly, the general consensus among the tasters of this beer who could distinguish the odd beer out, which, arguably could be just people who randomly got it right, was that the first wort hopped beer offered a smoother bittering profile than the control beer, which is what is, you expect from a first wort hop based on the claims out there. So I'm not sure if that impression was influenced maybe by their knowledge of the variable or not, but it seemed interesting to me.
I agree. It is definitely interesting. And I always love experiments that, making an effort for BJCP judges and, professional brewers, because it's really interesting to see like if the sample size or the pool of participants influences the results.
Yeah.
And probably the other big American version of testing was, you mentioned in the beginning of the article, the recent study done at Oregon State University, which is actually
that's right.
Yep, it was performed by Christina Hahn and Dr. Thomas Shellhammer, and Stan Hieronymus actually wrote about it in an article he called "We Might Have Been Wrong About First Wort Hopping." Which I think people took that title to mean that first wort hopping itself is wrong, that it actually doesn't do anything, which Stan later points out wasn't his intention for that article, so everyone can breathe easy. But I
can't imagine people on the internet taking things the wrong way. God.
Well, in Stan obviously critiques the study, and so what Hahn and Dr. Shellhammer found was they compared beers made with the hops added at first wort hop and a beer with the hops added at the beginning of the boil. And their panel of 35 people who kind of were just, self-identified beer drinkers, which is a pretty wide spectrum. But they found that in that panel of 35 that they were unable to reliably distinguish a difference between those beers.
Yeah. So kind of backing up the findings from Denny and, insinuating that maybe first wort hopping doesn't have this qualitative impact, at least when used more with a focus on bittering than a standard bittering kettle edition, which I think is really interesting. Before we take a break, there's one other aspect of first wort hopping that I think we should hit on, and that's the impact that it has on actual IBU, on actual bitterness. I know that Denny had his tested. The German group of researchers that we talked about from the previous research had theirs tested. And what it looks like is that by first wort hopping, you're getting about 10% more extraction of those bitterness compounds, so a little bit, 10% more IBU in essence than a 60-minute kettle edition or a standard bittering kettle edition.
That's right. And it makes, thinking about it, it makes perfect sense that 175 degrees Fahrenheit is typically that isomerization temperature we think about when those alpha acids become more soluble. And because they're above that temperature for a longer period of time, you're going to get a little more extraction. But, eventually there's some diminishing returns on how long the hops are in the boil.
And 10%, that's only 10%. It doesn't sound like,
right.
It's not too much. But it does have an impact. It would seem that on an objective level, first wort hopping does have an impact on the amount of bitterness that ends up making it into the finished beer. Well, with all of this stuff in mind, we, of course, decided to test it out for ourselves to see what kind of things we could find. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the experiments that Brülosophy has done on first wort hopping. If, like me, you prefer the simpler side of brewing beer, you have got to check out the Brew Bag, a food-safe fabric filter that allows for mashing of the finest crushed grain without risking the dreaded stuck sparge. I've been recommending these things since I started using them. They are awesome. The Brew Bag offers the only completely reinforced fabric filter for brewing that can be used over 100 times and comes in sizes that fit most mash tuns, or you can even have one custom made. Go check the Brew Bag out at brewinabag.com and be sure to use promo code TBP17 to get 10% off your order of $30 or more. So back in 2015, I'd been using the first wort hop approach for my brewing for probably a couple of years. I thought it would be fun to test this thing out, and so and what I wanted to do was take these beers to what's now called HomebrewCon, the National Homebrewing Conference in San Diego. And so I brewed these beers, I brewed some beers, had them all set up to take there for data collection. The beer that I made for the first wort hop experiment was a Helles Export. It was a Helles that I got better efficiency on than I expected. So it was about 1050 OG. And for this one, what I did was I tried to match the IBU expected based on, Beersmith. And so I used, for the first wort hop condition, I used 54 grams of Spalter hops and 59 grams in the 60-minute boil edition to reach a predicted IBU of 28.3 in both. And so, I wasn't sure if this would make that big of a difference, but my thinking on this one was that if we kept that IBU the same, we'd get, the results would show us, especially if they were different, whether, it was that would allow us to say whether it was actual, the flavor and aroma aspect that made it distinguishable, or if it was the bitterness. That was my thinking, at least. The beers were treated identically otherwise, fermented cool, all that stuff. They were Helles, and I fermented with a traditional lager yeast. I brought the beers down to NHC in San Diego and served them to 39 participants, mostly BJCP judges and experienced beer drinkers. And we also served the beer to Denny Kahn himself, the dude who did one of the previous research experiments on first wort hopping. So I thought that was kind of cool. He was unaware. All of them were completely unaware of what the variable was. We kept them blind to the variable. And in order, with 39 participants, in order for us to reach significance, 19 of them would have had to identify the odd beer out. That's a pretty good number, pretty high number. Interestingly, only 15 of these experienced beer drinkers were able to identify the unique sample, which left us with a p-value of 0.30. That's not significant. So we weren't able to say with any confidence that the first wort hopping, at least in this experiment and the way we used it here, produced a beer that was, qualitatively different from the 60-minute kettle edition hopped beer.
Yeah, and what I found interesting about this experiment, because I remember reading this one actually, one of the common critiques we hear especially early on when Brülosophy was new, was that if the participant pool was composed entirely of like BJCP judges, then the response would likely be different. That people with a more trained palate would be able to pick out differences that might be more subtle. And I remember reading in this conclusion and being a little blown away that you'd mentioned that if you parsed out the data that was only from BJCP judges from that sample of 39, that they actually had a really similar response rate.
Yeah, there was no, this wasn't one of those things where, people like to, I call it the shitty palates argument, but
right.
When results of an experiment like this go against our belief, we look for excuses as to why. And I think the easiest thing to defer to is, well, your tasters suck. It's just that they're bad tasters. The reality is, you come and do this kind of thing and you'll see it's not that they suck unless you want to admit that you suck, you know what I mean? Which I think we could humble ourselves sometimes in that respect. But
sure.
Really what it is that these variables, and particularly talking about first wort hopping, doesn't impart this crazy flavor or bitterness difference that a lot of us presumed it did. And I was sort of bummed out on this one. I hadn't thought about getting the IBU tested, sending it into a lab and getting it tested. So I don't know what the actual bitterness levels were in both of these beers. I have to assume, just based on what Denny and the German research group found, that the first wort hop beer maybe had 2 to 3 more IBU than the 60-minute kettle edition beer. But I don't really know. And what I can say is afterwards, in conversations I had with people who were who participated in this experiment, and it included a bunch of friends of ours. You've got Eric Casino from ericbrews.com,
yep.
Denny Kahn, I believe Derek Springer did this one, a whole bunch of people, and just chatting with them about the beers, all of them said that it was a good example of the style. There was no negative impressions of the beer, and when I asked them, the people who got it right, even what they thought was different about it, the kind of overriding response was, I don't really know. It was typical responses. Oh, one maybe tastes a little more fruity than the other one, just because we're looking for
sure.
You're looking
hunting
for a reason for it to be different. Yeah, exactly. So that kind of left me with this impression that they really weren't that different. And in my own blind triangle test, I could not tell them apart reliably. It amounted to me just guessing, which I thought was pretty interesting. So what happened was about 2-3 months ago, I thought, time to readdress this issue. And what I want to do is approach an experiment on first wort hopping slightly different than we did on the last one. I really wanted to parse out the impact that first wort hopping had. And so what I did is I designed an experiment where the first wort hop beer and the 60-minute kettle edition beer received the same amount of hops, and it was the only hop addition. So what I did is I designed a German Pilsner 1052 OG, a single, I believe it was a single malt, maybe a little bit of Vienna on top of some Pilsner malt.
Yep.
And then I did 80 grams of Hallertau Mittelfrüh. I believe it was 2.3% alpha acid. So I needed a lot to get the proper amount of bitterness in this beer. 80 grams at either first wort hop or at a 60-minute kettle edition. No other hop additions. So these worts just got boiled for 60 minutes without any other hop additions. They were treated identically otherwise. I chilled them down, fermented them in the same types of fermenters, and ultimately served these beers to 21 tasters who had no idea what the variable was. For this one, for 21 participants, we would have needed 12 to get it right in order for us to say that there was a significant difference. And lo and behold, exactly 1/3 or 7 participants correctly identified the odd beer out, which leaves us with a p-value of 0.58 and with the ability to say that exactly what we would expect from random guessing is what we got. So this was not a significant experiment. I could not tell these beers apart for the life of me. They tasted exactly the same. And leaving me, again, with this idea that first wort hopping, at least when used as a replacement for a standard bittering addition, really doesn't seem to have that big of an impact, despite the effect it has on IBU. And I did send these beers in for lab testing to Oregon Brew Lab, an awesome sponsor of ours who does these tests for us. Really cool folks. And I sent 2 samples in. I left Dana blind to what the variable was and what beers were in each flask. I just kind of innocuously marked the vials that I sent into her. And based on her testing, the first Wort hop beer had an IBU of 15.5. The 60-minute Kettle Edition beer had an IBU of 13.5. And I believe the error is plus or minus 0.5, something like that. Which is about, the first Wort hop beer had about 10% more bitterness than the 60-minute edition, which I think is pretty cool, right? And confirms this idea that Denny put out there years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty consistent with, both what obviously you mentioned, like the German testing found that as well. And it's also consistent with some more recent experiments run by some production breweries here in the U.S. Actually, Deschutes Brewing, they, in 2008, did a batch where they had a calculated IBU of 243, which is above even what we would consider to be, like the upper IBU threshold for taste.
243 IBU?
A calculated 243 IBU beer. And they actually measured it, and in the fermenter, it was 117 IBUs. And in the bottle, it was 87.
Wow.
So that's half. And that obviously is not necessarily first Wort hopping, but it is there. It's just going to show like some of those calculations are.
Yeah. Well, and I think so. Okay, so that's really interesting, and I think most people are kind of grasping this concept that IBU really is more of a measuring stick, at least the way I use it these days when I'm designing a recipe is, okay, what was the last beer I made using these hops in this sort of form? What was the IBU and what did I think about the bitterness? Okay, I'm going to go up or down from there. So it's sort of relative to my process on some degree. I think this kind of doesn't have much to do with the variable of first Wort hopping as much as it does IBU, but the expected bitterness based on Beersmith for both of these beers, I'll just read it off and I'll read all of the different formulas. For Tinsith, this beer, the first Wort hop beer was supposed to be 25.6 IBU, while the 60-minute beer was supposed to be 23.3. Rager had them at 30.6 and 27.8 respectively, and Garrett's had them at 25.6 and 23.3 respectively. Again, just to reiterate, the measured IBU in these was 15.5 for the first Wort hop beer and 13.5 for the 60-minute edition. That's quite a bit lower than what was predicted by Beersmith, and I'm at a loss as to why that is.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said for some of it. Could be possibly like different harvests of hops have different amounts of acids in them, and like alpha acids. It could be that, obviously because of storage that alpha acids go down over time. And it could be a staling reaction. I'm not totally sure. It baffles me a little bit.
What's really interesting to me is, I still had these beers on tap when I got the results from Oregon Brew Lab back. And I went out there and I pulled samples of both of them. And I'm are these really not that bitter? They were their German Pilsner bitter. They had that nice, crisp, sharp bitterness that you expect in a German Pilsner. Now, albeit, they only received that single edition up front, but again, with my kind of dogmatic belief that the earlier you add hops, the more bitterness you're going to get. It was surprising to me. I would never have expected the IBU to be down in the 13 to 15 range for these beers. No way.
Yeah, me neither. It's crazy.
Yeah. So, well, I think from these two experiments, what we can kind of glean is that first Wort hopping, you're going to get a little bit more, I guess, hop, bitterness extraction, a little bit more, not too much, maybe about 10% more, as Denny has said in the past. And there are some other benefits. Something we haven't touched on. Are there purported, downsides to first Wort hopping, or like potential problems that can arise from using this method?
Not a lot that I've found. In terms of having them earlier in the boil, there seems to be really only benefits. That first Wort hopping can actually be used to reduce boil overs. And they may actually be foam positive. So doing a first Wort hop is obviously going to put more physical matter into the boil, and it'll help keep the boil over down. And then some of those compounds that get carried over and that, react during the non-boil phase while it's all heating up may actually carry compounds into your beer that contribute a positive foam character.
Yet again, something that just doesn't make sense at all to my my silly little mind here. I don't know how that can work, but hey, if it does, it does. I first wort hop every beer that I make. The way I see it with first wort hopping, given the fact that it is going to increase your IBU, assuming you're using the same amount as a 60-minute addition, what that means, I think one of the implications is that, if you're brewing and you want less hop matter, but you want that same bitterness, you can throw in a first wort hop and take out a couple grams or ounces, however you look at it, of that hop addition to reduce the vegetal matter that's actually in the beer during the boil, get the same IBU. But like you mentioned, the primary reason I continue to first wort hop is because it completely eliminates the chances of that crazy volcanic eruption that occurs when you toss in your first bittering addition of hops. The nucleation points on those hop pellets just, at least in my experience, create a sticky mess, and first wort hopping eliminates that. So that's why I do it. I don't know if I'm at this point, I'm pretty convinced it doesn't impact the flavor or aroma of my beer. And I've been pleased with the results so far. So I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah. And for me, definitely like I mentioned, like I first actually learned about this technique when I was doing research for Czech Pilsners, and you see this a lot because, it's Czech Pilsner, an important aspect of it is like a smoother, well-rounded bitterness, and people hunt for that kind of characteristic. So I've been doing it in my brewing for a long time, and after these experiments, and after doing a little more research and not understanding necessarily the process, I stopped doing it for a ton of beers. I haven't noticed any change in my beers whatsoever. But reading more about it for this podcast and reading more about it, just, trying to give myself a better beer education. I got to admit that I'm interested in it. It's something that I think is super interesting, and especially because it's one of the things that we still don't have a ton of research on, and we still don't know a lot about the mechanisms that go into first wort hopping. So I think it's super interesting. So I'm thinking I'm going to try it again, but I definitely don't do it in any of my beers. I really don't have any problems with boil over.
Oh, that's because you're extra special, Matt, and I'm not. And there is something I feel like an opportunity for us, something to explore in the future is this idea that first wort hopping by removing 30% of that later addition, that can have an impact. So far, the two experiments we've done have been focused more on, I think, I guess I would contend that the focus has been more on this bitterness component. Basically, both times what we did is we swapped out the 60-minute addition for a first wort hop addition and wanted to see if that had an impact. How do you suppose we would design an experiment to test this, the flavor and aroma impact? I ask that because it seems to me like by doing that, unless going back to that German research, the group's study, to me, it seems more like a comparison between a first wort hop and a later hop addition.
Sure.
How might we design an experiment to test out this aroma and flavor impact where everything else is equal, so that we can say in the end, this difference was most likely caused by the first wort hop addition? Yeah.
And I think that's a tough one, just because, like, obviously if we stick with the traditional approach, which is removing 30% of the late hop additions and using them as a first wort hop, it'd be pretty quick to say that, like, we might be testing a difference in IBUs and a difference in bitterness that might be contributing to how, like, the perceptible difference in those beers. But I think that would be the approach, is that we actually do what that German study did. I probably would not remove the late addition. I would keep that full late addition for one of the beers and remove 30% from the beer that would receive a first wort hop treatment, and see if there was a difference that way.
Yeah. And I think, thinking about it, my hunch is that there would be a perceptible difference, only because, when you're moving 30% of the late additions and you're using them in what has been shown to increase bitterness, to me that, and so we would be able to say at least that, there is a difference here, right?
So if, Mark, I've heard you say that before. and we've gotten insignificant results. So I don't know. I'm super open to thinking about how to design that experiment. And if anyone out there has ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, likewise. And you can let any of us know our first name at brülosophy.com. That'd be really cool. I do think in an experiment like that, though, I think where the meaningful information comes from would be in the evaluative comparison done by those who got the triangle test right, and presuming that it was a significant portion of tasters who got it right. That could be some really meaningful information, actually, and then just conversations with those tasters after the fact about what it was that they thought was different about the beers. That could reveal quite a bit. So that's definitely on the docket. We're gonna keep exploring this whole first wort hop thing. Is there anything else about first wort hopping that you've got, Matt?
No, I think that based off of the research that we see here and based off of the research that's been done in the past, that you definitely don't need to approach first wort hopping as a tried and true necessity for your brewing, but it's absolutely worth exploring. And if it's something that makes your brew day a little easier, or it's something that you feel makes your beer better, that there's a lot to be said for some of its benefits.
I couldn't have put it better myself. Well, if you enjoy what we're doing here and want to help us bring you more, head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can help us out. And don't forget to check out the rewards you can get for supporting us at patreon.com/brülosophy. If you have any questions you want answered on a future Brew&A episode, you can email them to marshall@brülosophy.com, or if you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, you can ask there too. If you'd be so kind as to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, we'd really appreciate it. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with the next episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no